I'm Nicky Rowbotham, and I'm here today to talk to you more about boundaries and how having proper, effective, clear, consistent, and kind boundaries in your life is one of the most badass moves you can make. So too often, and in fact, I'm the perfect candidate of this. If you'd spoken to me 4 years ago, my boundaries look like scuffed chalk marks on the floor. And so I'm here today to help you really understand, what are boundaries? What are the biggest myths about boundaries that we often hold? How should they feel? What makes us boundaryless in the first place? And in addition to that, really, how can we start to hold boundaries that really feel easeful within our lives, rather than really these sort of rigid, reactionary boundaries that too often we really do hold in our lives? Join me for that. The biggest myth about boundaries is that someone else is crossing them. A lot of people find that a very controversial statement, but really it is the absolute truth. We allow others to cross our boundaries. It's really within our power as we hold space for ourselves, saying no to the things we mean to say no to, rather than saying yes to everything we instinctively know that really is a full body sort of reaction from our side. So start to think about, as we go into boundaries, what are the things that you're saying yes to in your life that you know within your gut, within your body, should be a no? So what are boundaries? Boundaries are the delineation between you and myself. It's basically where I end and you begin. And it's not something that can be an either or, it's an and statement. It's you and I. I can love you and I can love myself when we start to hold boundaries that are clear, consistent, and kind. And it's so important to bring that energy to when you're holding boundaries, because we often don't think about the energy behind our boundaries. When we're stressed out and reactionary, and we haven't really been holding boundaries for a long time in our lives, or similar to my earlier statement, they feel like scuffed chalk marks on the floor. No one knows where they are, including yourself. Well, then it becomes incredibly difficult for us to really then begin to hold them. But it's the most essential thing we can do. So how do I spoke about how boundaries feel. I want to give you a few clues that you can really bring back into your sort of emotional state around how your boundaries are feeling. Boundaries that are clear, consistent, and kind should really feel like a gentle garden gate, rather than an electric fence or a doormat. But too often, we sit in one of those wounded states from a boundary perspective, really not holding space for ourselves. And when we start to become resentful, having overgiven, having said yes when we really mean no, that is really where we know it's the number one sign that a boundary is needed. Where we feel that resentment from overgiving, that is the number one sign as well that we're out of alignment with ourselves. We're not holding our own sense of power, and we're really moving out of that boundaried state, which is just so powerful when we really tune back in to that inner energetic state within ourselves. So what happens when we move into, for example, that more electric fence feeling state of boundaries? Well, really, that's when we almost haven't been holding that space for ourselves. We're chasing something else outside of ourselves. And so pay attention to what those stories are that have crept into your narrative for so long. It could have been you're chasing a delivery that leads to a sense of self-worth. That often builds us into that sort of perpetual people-pleasing where we just say yes to all of these things. And when we get stressed out and everything starts to happen up close and personal to us, that is where we react. That's where we almost trigger back very reactionary rather than responding like that gentle garden gate that boundaries should feel like. The other side is those scuffed chalk marks on the floors I mentioned earlier, where we start to feel like a doormat. We're just saying yes to everyone else's agendas and not holding that space for ourselves to really build and hold that energy for ourselves. And that's why I often say that boundaries are the cornerstones of our resilience. They allow us to hold that space and say yes to the things that really matter. Because when we say yes to the things that don't matter to us, our bodies feel it. We know that we're giving our best energy to everyone else other than ourselves. And that's such an important piece when we start to look at the level of burnout and stress responses that we're seeing with so many people at the moment. That's really where we have allowed ourselves to be boundaryless for way too long. And it's so important to then come back and start to hold boundaries for ourselves. So how do we start to hold boundaries for ourselves? Well, in my experience, and having been a leader in corporate for over 22 years, trust me, this is one of the hardest things I had to do, especially with people that used to trigger me, that used to really sort of, have those moments where I sort of reacted from a stress perspective because I'd almost anticipated their needs. And it is so tough when you've been boundaryless for a long time with certain people, because all of a sudden you think, well, what are they going to think when I'm now holding a boundary for myself where I haven't previously allowed myself to hold this boundary? It becomes incredibly challenging, and often especially when our lack of boundaries has been convenient for another person. That's often where I think we feed into that energy of, I'm going to let someone down. What are they going to think if I'm now drawing this boundary? And it should really be more than a chalk mark on the floor. It should be something that we hold clearly and consistently. We can't hold a boundary in one area of our lives and then not in another area of our lives. It's important that we become consistent in all areas of our lives. And so start to think where you can start to hold boundaries within your lives. I encourage people to really start to almost make a boundary inventory. And I know that sounds very structured, but it's so important to reflect in all areas of your life. What are those areas where you do hold boundaries and maybe where you don't? And give yourself credit for where you hold them really well and you hold them with ease, so that you don't feel like that electric fence, but you feel more like that gentle garden gate, where you can start to say, no, thank you so much, but it's a no for me. And that's why I say to people, once you've started to analyze where you hold those boundaries, think about the ones where you're going to give yourself that thumbs up and say, that's a good job, but also the ones you want to improve on or where you want to start holding those boundaries. And when it comes to looking at that list of places where you want to start to hold boundaries within your life across relationships, work, any area of your life, don't just think about one area, think about your life holistically. And then we come to what I call the 3 S's of boundaries. It's so important that when you think about these 3 S's from boundaries, it starts small, start safe, and start succinct. And so when we start to think about starting small, use an everyday scenario where you need to hold space for yourself, telling you that your body, your nervous system, and your stress responses, that it's okay to hold space for yourself. If your coffee gets delivered incorrectly, or someone walks past you and you don't say anything, it's important that we stand up for ourselves and we let our bodies know, our energy know, that I'm going to just calmly hold the space for myself. So practice on the small things, the everyday things. Then think about how you can start safe. Starting safe is so important because you don't start, as I mentioned earlier, with those people who've triggered you for so long. You start with a family member who you know you can fumble over your words and you can really start to talk about, what this means for you and why you're changing your behavior. Talk it through, help them understand why you're cleaning up your side of the street, and help them understand that, you really would like them to help you respect and clean up their side of the street as well. I mentioned earlier that boundaries are an and statement, you and I. And that's because I can love you and I can love myself at the same time when we hold boundaries that are clear, consistent, and kind. And then we start to think about the 3rd S from a boundaries perspective, and that is start succinct. As a woman, specifically, for too long, I used to over-explain my no's. I used to think I had to have a really good reason why I was saying no to something. But really what we have to understand is that no is a complete sentence. We actually dilute our personal power. We dilute our energy when we don't hold that space for ourselves without having to over-explain it. The other person will sense that you're not really solid and sure about that boundary, and often they'll push back. Often they'll test a boundary. Just ask any kid who's tried to push boundaries with you. That's what happens when we set boundaries every single day. So you have to be succinct. For example, if you're getting an invite to go for a social occasion, it's so important to just say, "Thank you, but I'm busy." You don't need to give a reason why. So really, this has been how I've been speaking about boundaries for a long time, and we'll talk more about it in the next segment as well. But I really want to recap just a few key points for you at the end of the segment. It's so important to understand that we hold boundaries for ourselves. No one else crosses them. We've allowed them to be crossed. It's so important to understand what made you boundaryless in the first instance. Was it the fact that you were chasing self-worth outside of yourself? Was it the fact that you were playing small in one of those wounded victim states? Where have you been overgiving and then becoming resentful as a result of it because you weren't holding space for yourself? And then start to think about how your boundaries feel and how you can then start to hold boundaries by starting small, safe, and succinct.
The hybrid experiment is full of options, looseness, and ambiguity. Do your ExCo members, team leaders, and line managers need to sharpen up their hybrid leadership skills? Whether you are behind the webcam or in the office, authentically showing up and managing your emotions and those of others is part of being a connected, high-touch leader. They've been using my 5-minute Hybrid Leadership Nudge series. It's a punchy, practical series produced by my team in video, audio, and written format. We can customize and brand this content specifically for your organization. While it's natural for you to want to over-control what feels out of control, don't become the boss that becomes the bottleneck because you resort to micromanaging everyone. This Leadership Nudge series will support your leaders on a growth journey as they shift to managing and leading in a hybrid world. Connect with me at info@nickybush.com to discuss how I can help you.
Hi everybody and welcome to HybriCON. You're with me, Nicky and Keezy. We just had a phenomenal keynote from Nicky Rowbotham. Now, if you've ever thought about boundaries, where you're at with your boundaries, are you doing well, are you not, should you see a therapist? I don't know about you, but I was sitting in the corner. I thought that absolutely resonates with me and where I am right now. So thank you so much for sharing that. You know, when you started to describe boundaries as being, proper, effective, clear, succinct, but one of the things that you said is that boundaries are kind.
Yeah.
And I thought that's powerful because I've heard that before from Brene Brown.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the kindness behind boundaries?
And Brene Brown talks about clarity as kind and a lack of clarity is unkind. And that happens in so many aspects of our lives. And for me, the biggest thing with boundaries is they're a hygiene factor in our lives. A lot of people think they're optional, or they think it can be you or me, as I said earlier. And then we forget these boundaries that we're supposed to hold. But then when we feel that we haven't been holding space for ourselves and we perceive someone to have overstepped them because we haven't made them clear and consistent is the other piece there, we then almost react. And that's where I brought through that sense of the electric fence. And trust me, all of this work is based on my lived experience. So I've been that reactionary person many times over. But what I realized is it was really sitting with me to hold that space. And when we hold it with consistency and clarity every single time, everyone else knows what that boundary is. It's almost become, it's like the lanes on a road.
Yes.
We know where it is. And everyone then works together. And if we do need to sort of shift slightly, we have a conversation. It's like responsible energy management, which we all need. But if we move out of our lane without asking permission, it's how do we hold that space back for ourselves and say, hang on, that's really not okay for me right now. And that's so hard to do nowadays.
It's hard, but it's so good. It's so good. And when you're talking, one of the things that I thought makes it hard is that people think, oh, you're loving yourself too much. And it's, no, I'm being healthy for both you and me. And that and is a big one, because I think oftentimes what causes that sense of reactionariness is that I have to choose between you and I. It has to be either or. And the truth is, with good boundaries, there's space for everybody. I want to talk a little bit about your journey and how you ended up in this place. And I see you have your wonderful book here. And I think maybe just talking to that is, what if I didn't know this was a boundary for me? Like, I didn't know until I had that electric shock. And I was like, wait, Nikki, you shouldn't be here. This is not, this is not okay. How do we go about identifying where these boundaries definitely need to be?
Well, I think definitely it's that lack of that lack of alignment within ourselves, and resentment is normally that number one sign where we get like that. Hang on, I feel like you're asking for too much here, and sometimes it's low grade, and sometimes it's a big reaction, and it also depends on our stressed out state that we're sitting in. And I think just going back to your earlier points around people perceiving it to be around loving yourself too much, I say it's being centered in your self-worth, your personal power, and self-ownership. Because you're taking care of your side of the road, we now expect, with clarity, other people to do the same on theirs. So it often inspires people as well. But I haven't quite answered your question yet, so I'm just going to come back to, like, how do you know how do you start when maybe you've realized you haven't been setting a boundary? Well, the perfect time is right now. And maybe it's sometimes, if it's a big boundary, step away from the situation. If someone's asking you for something right now, say to them, can I get back to you tomorrow? Can I sleep on it? That instant real-time world that we live in, I think we often think that we have to respond immediately. So sometimes we just have to, if we don't immediately know in our guts and in our knowing, our intuition as I call it, we often, like we battle to hold that, and that's when we often say yeses when we mean no. And so that's when I say hold space and come back to it. But if you know it's no immediately, you can just say no thank you, or not now. That's the other thing. If it's maybe not a priority right now, put it off. But the biggest thing is to start small and start today. Even if you get it wrong and you're a little bit reactionary, don't judge yourself. Just go, I'm going to do that better next time.
Yeah, and it's a process, and it's giving ourselves permission to go through that process. And for me, a big ouchie was when you said we allow other people to violate our boundaries. It's not them, but it's been us that hasn't, kept that wall in place, or that specific boundary in place. And what I want to go in sort of underneath that is, what is that discomfort? What is it in us that feels a little squeamish around going, no, Nikki, it's a no, or I'm not okay with that, I'm not comfortable. Why do we struggle?
I think, there's a lot of conditioning. And I actually talk to unshackling from the shoulds, which is a lot of that conditioning that we work with in society, whether it be from childhood, whether it be, something that's come into our work environments or our relationship environments. And I think it's that conditioning, those shoulds, that we often kind of bring in insidiously, and often think about how many times you say should during the course of a day. When we take that self-worth outside of ourselves, or we think it's going to get us something. I call it chasing the gold stars of everyone else's validation, when the only validation we actually need in this world is from ourselves. Because this is the only person we need to take care of, really, at the end of the day. We can give to others and we can be, very considerate of others, but we can't leave ourselves out of the equation. And for too long we have. And so I think, what we're worried about is we're worried about that negative reaction and letting people down, because we've attached to their opinions and that self-worth that we get from other people's reactions. But if we realize that we have to pay attention to letting ourselves down too, holding space becomes a priority.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing in that as well is just the bravery to go me, the bravery to disconnect from what has been a source of validation that I've needed for so long, or what has been, I actually don't know what to do next unless I ask you, And so I'm in that cycle through, my parents, and now my friends, and now my boss, I've created a validation loop. And sometimes I think that authenticity is understanding that, cutting those things means you're going to have to stand in your power a little bit. trust yourself a bit more.
Yeah.
But that's okay. You can build trust within yourself and within your body. After the break, we're going to talk a little bit more about how boundaries have energy and what that looks like.
You've had a bad day.
Many times have you sat in a presentation or meeting, in person or online, where you literally want to tear your hair out because it is so boring. It's so boring and you're trying to pay attention, and if you happen to be doing it virtually, you've got to sit there with your camera on, sort of smiling, looking into the camera because you know other people are looking at you, but your mind is just whirling, and what you want to do is switch your camera off and go and get a peanut butter sandwich. I want you to think back to the last time you presented information, either virtually or in person. Think about what it would do for your career if you could present information in a really compelling, effective, motivating, inspiring way. In this module of maximizing your presentations in person and virtually, we're going to look at who your audience is, how you craft a message, and there are a couple of things that you can do that make your presentations so much more effective if you just know how to understand who your audience is, what you want them to think, feel, and do as a result of your presentation. So how can we ensure that when you're presenting information, you do it in a way that engages the audience? So please click on the button below to ensure that you enhance your presentation impact, be it in person or virtually.
Hello and welcome back to HybriCON 2022 with myself and Ziggy Mkize, and we're talking boundaries are badass with Nicky Rowbotham. Now, Nicky, I really enjoyed your keynote, and we've been chatting throughout the break even. So many gems and so many things that I think are so important. And I know you write about this in your book, so I want to talk about your book a little bit.
Sure.
And during the break, you were telling me about energy, and that's one of the things you mentioned in your keynote, that boundaries are energy. Boundaries have energy. What is that about?
You've got to think about the energy that you show up with anywhere. And a lot of people say to me, I can't understand energy. And that's when I say to people, no, think about, when someone's behind you in traffic and they're bobbing and weaving.
Yeah.
You feel it even then. Someone's walking into a meeting room. And the way that we hold our boundaries has a frequency that comes across to people. And it can either be one of ease, that gentle garden gate, where you just say, no, don't over-explain it. But when we're stressed out, and I talk a lot in my first book, which is called 7 Steps to Finding Flow, Flip the Script on Stress, around how energetic states come back into your nervous system, and they can either feel like a tightly clenched fist or a gently unfurling hand. That's that stressed out state, or that easefulness where we can flow through our day and find a balance that serves us and hold space for ourselves with grace and kindness. And so when we come to boundaries, when we're stressed out and we have been holding that space, our nervous systems are strung out. They're looking for safety. And then things are happening to us up close and personal where we've overgiven for so long. And that's when we react rather than respond from a centered space. And the other side of the wounded sort of paradigm, as I call it, around boundaries, is that doormat energy, where we've people pleased, where we've played small, where we've been hiding out. All of those are wounded states that we can get into. And we often sit there, and in both of those wounded states, in terms of, really giving that ultimatum, which feels like an electric fence, or the people pleasing, that's where we've overgiven, where we haven't held space for ourselves, and we're not in alignment with ourselves. So again, think about that analogy of a tightly clenched fist or a gently unfurling hand, because the two wounded states are really our nervous systems almost doing this, going, you're not holding space for me. I'm going to have to do this by reacting rather than responding. And in our stress states, you either go fight or, you fight or flight. And that's generally going to a state of freeze.
Or freeze, and you're just like, what just happened to me? Or I didn't expect that to happen. The book is called Embrace Your Elegant Power, Your Path to Success Through Ease. And you can get a copy of the book
Yeah.
from you?
All good bookstores in South Africa, Amazon, it's an ebook, it's an audio format, or my website, nickyrowbotham.com.
It's fabulous, and I quite like your book because it's your journey interlaced with the learning experiences, with the research, with the tools that we can use. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was in this point around the reaction and the tension in our bodies, and then going, how do I hold boundaries in a space or in the face of trauma? You know, so I'm in a space and I've instantly realized, oh, actually, I need a boundary, and this boundary hasn't been here. But it's also quite traumatic for me right now. This person feels like a threat to me, or this experience feels unsafe for me. You know, what's one way a person can introduce a boundary in the face of trauma?
Well, I think the first thing a person has to do in that face of feeling, you know, reactionary and traumatized, and it also depends on the type of trauma you're sitting with. And again, I go into that a lot more around the nervous system states in my first book. But what I say to people is hold space. Don't respond immediately. And it's often, you know, a case of just a few seconds. Take a few deep breaths. Take a sip of the water that you've got in front of you on the table. And if you're really struggling, I often say to people, put your hand on your heart. You don't have to tell people what you're doing when you do this. I often just repeat to myself in the middle of the situation, my best is good enough.
So good.
And then you just come with that calm statement coming back. And if you don't get it right, you can go back again. Nothing's final. Nothing's cast in stone. You can go back to that person and say, actually, I've been thinking about it. And this is where I think, or how we need to approach it, or this is my answer. I think we think once we've committed to something, we don't have any choices. Or use that tactic of, can I get back to you tomorrow?
Yes. I like that. I want to talk a little bit about alignment. You know, so I've identified this person's a trigger. I've identified, okay, I haven't been holding space for myself in this way, and this does require a boundary. I've also identified that when this happens, my body actually does get very tense. So there's a trauma response in here somewhere. How do we get back to a place of, firstly, knowing and acknowledging the honesty within our own system, and then going, okay, we need to come into alignment with that?
And I talk about this a lot in my book, Embrace Your Elegant Power. In fact, there's an entire chapter called Boundaries Are Badass in there, and I've actually developed a masterclass as well on that. But talking about those very reactionary triggered responses, we all know what it's like when you get that email from that person or a WhatsApp coming through and you immediately anticipate that stress response that's coming through. I often say, you actually have to go away and hold space for yourself in a different way. And especially where it's a big boundary, where you've been boundaryless for so long, I often ask people to start to write a script. Start to actually say, these are the points I want to put forward, remembering to keep it succinct. And don't keep it, don't make it personal, keep it impersonal. And don't make it about the other person, make it about how you feel. And I actually had to do this recently with a very big scenario that I'd been, almost avoiding for a few months, but I knew. I was like, it's unequivocal, the boundary has to come. But I also knew I had to do it when I was ready so that I wouldn't be triggered in that conversation. And really some of the languaging that I used, as I said, I know that this wasn't your intent.
That's good.
But this was how I experienced it. And it took any sort of tension or fuse out of that conversation, because even though 3 months ago I would have been, that's absolutely the intent in the conversation, in that space, it actually allowed us to have a very calm and clear, conversation where we could understand each other, understand where we were both coming from, and clear up any of the miscommunications that had happened. And so make it impersonal, write a bit of a script, and hey, if you have to, read it, because it's so important that you, again, hold space for yourself in that conversation.
That's so good. And what I'm hearing in that is the ability to have an intention, that if I'm going to bring this up with you, what do I want from it? And I think too often we maybe go in wanting to make the other person feel the same way, or demanding an apology without the other person understanding how they violated a boundary because it wasn't there before. So people are going to go home and they're going to start small, they're going to start succinct, and they're going to start in a place where they feel safe. How do we fight the temptation to not go back to violating our boundaries?
I think the biggest thing is understanding, as you said earlier, that this is a process. You're not going to be perfect. In fact, I've banned the word perfection in my life. And so it's a case of just creating that awareness continually. And where you do find yourself starting to become boundaryless again, where everything starts to look like those scuffed chalk marks on the floor, bring it back. And it's that continued awareness. And that's why I love creating that boundary sort of inventory, as it were. Put it up on your fridge. It's amazing how looking at it and going, okay, those are the 5 areas I'm focusing on boundaries. It embeds a new habit. And like going to gym, it's like training your muscle. The more you do it, the stronger you become.
Yeah, and that's what we want to be, the strong, authentic version of ourselves. For people who want to join your webinar masterclass next week, what can they look forward to in that?
We're going to be talking about embracing your personal power, really based on that concept of embracing your elegant power in my book. And I'll leave you with one quote as to exactly why I think it's an important webinar for you to attend. And that's the quote by Anne Lamott. The lighthouse doesn't run all over the island looking for boats to save. It just stands there shining. And that for me is the epitome of really owning our personal power, which for too long many people have confused with force or power over. So it's how do we really get centered in our own self-worth and our unique gifts, knowing that our best is good enough right now.
Yeah, and that centeredness is the true power. Nicky, thank you so much. That was so insightful. And I hope that you at home are feeling challenged and that you can just start thinking about your boundaries and how do you make sure that they are safe, succinct, and small. We're still carrying on with HybriCON 2022, so stay tuned for more insightful information, knowledge from various speakers.